All right, so I've been updating a few of my components, and I guess I'll start with responsive utility because you had me work on that today. But responsive utility, I guess, can illustrate the idea of behaviors and extending other elements. What you see here is there's a responsive utility element, and it's wrapping all of this content. And some of these spans say, only show for these sizes. And the element on the right has some custom breakpoints set for small, medium, large, extra large, and has the same, basically the same innards, but I changed my breakpoints between the two. And if I go like this, you'll notice that the highlighted part, one of them staying the same because the breakpoints are pretty high. The other one on the right is changing based on my breakpoints. What's going on here is that it's doing an element query on resizing so that I can apply, and basically I customize my breakpoints, and I have to, instead of it being an element query, I'm basically defining some styles based on this responsive size attribute. And that's how I'm able to do some styling and, work around the fact that we don't have real element queries. The easiest way to use it would be probably just to grab this responsive utility element wrapper, but that could very easily lead to something like a div soup. You just have a bunch of these nested, and maybe you don't want to, have a bunch of those. You could use it on a regular HTML element, in which case there's a little bit of JavaScript down here where I'm basically taking the same example but using some divs and calling a responsive utility singleton. And we talked about the idea of singletons last week, and I'll show that when I get to the code part. But what you see here is it's basically requesting this singleton and sending an event up that says, hey, treat me like a responsive element. This is the element. This is here, I'm giving it a custom attribute instead of responsive size, which is my default. I'm going to call that class, or I'm going to call that attribute element query. And then here are my custom breakpoints. And if that wasn't enough, I decided to, further scaffold it and say, well, maybe you don't want responsive utility element to be the responsive element. We've seen my video player, the Yali Media player. Maybe it should be a responsive element. So I'm going to talk a little bit about extending behaviors. So if I go into responsive utility, the very first of these things, or the core of the way responsive utility works, is this idea of the singleton that we talked about last week. It is basically just a single element that gets attached to the page called responsive utility. And all it's doing is basically listening to say, hey, is there a new responsive element? Let's add it to my list of responsive elements. Is it being deleted from the page? We can get rid of it and all of its listeners. And then it's handling all of the, applying the attributes, doing the queries to figure out the sizes based on the element's breakpoints. It's adding a resize observer and saying, all right, when this happens, we're going to do this logic, check the sizes, and use the details that element sent me about which attribute to put it to and which breakpoint value it belongs with. Now this one would work with any of the elements, including just using with the div here, the part that you saw with the JavaScript on this page. And the way I scaffolded it is I started with that singleton, but then said, hey, how do I package it up so that you don't always have to use JavaScript to call it? And so that's where I created the superclass. And the superclass is basically something that you can have other elements extend and use. So the superclass has basically a set of properties already defined in it. So why not already have a responsive size property that maps to an attribute? and the small, medium, large, and extra large. Let's set some defaults, and let's even include the fact that when it's first updated, it's going to request that singleton. If that singleton's not on the page, it'll attach it. When you see the dispatch piece, it's going to send the event up with whatever you've specified. And then if it gets disconnected, let's make sure that it's gone. So this set of behaviors could be used by any element, and I kind of created just that responsive utility, the one that I started with as the easiest, as just a nice little example of what it would take to actually make any of your elements happen to use responsive utility for your own element query workaround. So here it is. This is my example of an element that's using responsive utility. It's importing the responsive utility behaviors, which is that superclass, and extending it. And anything else you do in your elements, up to you. But that's how you would use it in an element, is you would just extend it and then you have it. So that was one of the things that I was doing today. What I was doing earlier this week, I was on that Storybook roll last week, so I've been working to try to get some things in Storybook. In the meantime, I updated my charts and graphs. So this, let me go back to this one first. I've been using Chartist Render to do some graphs and charts. And you can see these are the different versions. What I didn't have at the time was I was just using a data property that was an array to get the data in. No, it was actually an object. But what I realized is it would be really nice to do this with progressive enhancement. So there's now a slot that can read in a table and turn it into a chart. And there is the ability to include that table with show table, so that the table that you've included that is slotted is no longer hidden. But I added that. It also has the ability now to take a data source in. I don't know if I have that on the example page. I do not, but I have it in the other one. So, oh, no, it's a whole separate demo page. So this is one that is actually pulling it from a data source and grabbing a CSV file and then generating all of this and putting the table back into Shadow DOM. So the chart library is not mine, and they do have an accessibility plugin, but I liked being able to have this sitting in Light DOM. I liked being able to pull in the table and use the table to generate the data. And then what I really liked doing is creating a, just in the same way that I'm able to extend the responsive utility, I extended, so this is the basic one that would work for anybody, but I decided to extend this to our context with a different component called learning design bar chart line pie. It's a series of, or LRN design, sorry. It's a series of elements that are grouped together that are basically just using extending Chartist, the Chartist render stuff I made, and allowing us to have things like HAX wiring and some of our simple colors, which I demonstrated, that library of color combinations. So now it uses the accent color property, and you can see it gives you things that are kind of related to purples. I might have other examples here, not on that one. Line does. So here you can see our that simple colors library using just simple colors, but using light versus dark. And then there it is using like anything related to cyan. And the same with pi. And those, like I said, are just, it's just doing the same pattern of being able to extend another element to get all of those things in place. So if I go into moving to LRN, Oh, this one actually does have some cool extending stuff, and I didn't think I could talk about it. So what I realized is that I wanted to create these as a bunch of separate elements instead of a bunch of if statements, but they did have some shared things. So first of all, I'm pulling in that Chartist render superclass and extending it with another superclass called Learning Design Chart. And that superclass is going to hold all of the things that are common to all three chart types, plus some things that are common to just bar and line, because they had a lot more in common than pie chart. So one of the things that I did is I have this for our hacks wiring, line bar hacks properties, line bar properties. I have line bar options, and then I have my regular options, and I have some regular, like some actual setting of the properties and setting the line bar properties. And the way it works is when I extend it in bar, I'm just doing super properties and super line bar properties. And now I have the properties that are common to both. And when I get to my constructor, when I get to hacks, I have my super hacks properties, super line properties, all of them get wired in, and then anything unique to bar gets added onto there. And when I'm setting the properties, it's super set properties, super set line properties. Same thing happens in line. And then because pi doesn't need line bar, it is just doing super hacks properties and then adding its own and super options, super set properties. And that's how I was able to have these three related elements all have their own tags and be managed sort of separately, but then they have this base set of behaviors. They have base SAS files that are extending onto simple colors. And it definitely made managing them easier, so I didn't have code in multiple places. Any questions about that? It is seriously quiet.
Super quiet. I can ask you a question about superclasses. Right. So here's my concern with superclasses.
Which is?
And the way that you tend to do them, because I do love your abstraction of your head from the rest of you. If you've got like 6 superclasses all wrapped on an element, aren't you basically just entangling yourself between all of them? Or is it actually possible to keep things that abstract? So, well, I'll just go, let's start there.
I think that the order in which you wrap them actually affects that, but also in, yeah, I think how I'm extending them, it matters in the order, but I forget which order it is. I'm usually only combining like 2 at most at any given time. And sometimes if I don't need the entire, like inheriting all of the behaviors and all of the functions, what I end up doing is sometimes if I'm not using everything about simple colors, but I just want to grab the properties, I might just pull in simple colors from the top as something that I can use. And I'm not actually extending it here. I might just be, I think somewhere further, I might have simple colors dot properties or simple colors dot hacks properties or whatever, if I'm just using part of it and not inheriting the entire behavior. In this case, the core of what this is Chartist render. And so I didn't bother like mixing simple colors in there and furthering the complication. I was able to just pull it in other ways. Like I said, by pulling in, properties.
So the 2 paradigms that I'm thinking of is, like, I really like the superclass idea, and I've been using it a little bit. But how does this compare to the Singleton?
So with the Singleton, what I'm doing is managing multiple elements.
Okay.
But with this, when I choose to use the superclass, it's because I want to I want to be able to have that element have the properties. I want it to maybe have some of the behaviors, some of the functions that are already in these other pieces. I was hoping to have rich text editor available so that I could show that one as well. But just the idea of, all right, well, some of the general ways that this thing behaves, I should extend that.
Right.
And that when it's more about that is when I've been using, you know, extending these things.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Because it does seem like there is some overlap between those two patterns.
Yeah, like, and I think responsive utility kind of shows that there's a level of overlap that I could be doing certain things. The benefit being, like I said, like with the Chartist stuff, there are a lot of behaviors in that I wouldn't want to have to redo. And I mean, I guess you could potentially put some of them in a singleton on the page, but there's properties going on, things that I might be observing.
Right, right.
Styling.
Right, yep.
With regard to the first thing that you showed, the responsive element, would it be possible or desirable to make a query against oneself to look for a CSS variable that sets those breakpoints? Because then you could be able to, like, in the connected callback, as soon as it gets loaded, ask in that scope, whatever that scope happens to be, what is that SM variable set to, or that medium set to? Because then a user could set the global breakpoints for their website, and then have that, you know, even within a shadow root, be specified in the CSS, and not have to deal with adding individual attributes or properties directly.
Might be interesting.
With the caveat that, like, CSS variables are in a state in my mind where they're very, very, very powerful, but they're also just global state, and sometimes it's not a good idea to have global state, but sometimes it can help you a lot. So just throwing that out.
I hadn't really thought about that. Like, for some of the things that I'm using it for, there are specific layouts to things. Like in Video Player, there are certain points at which I know I'm going to need room just to fit all of the buttons, you know, because I can tell down to the pixel what it is. And so if the container so I needed kind of custom points to break, that I probably wouldn't want variables that are coming in from a CSS variable, because I know exactly what that player needs. But I could see how that would be useful.
In the same way that you have that control vocabulary for the hack schema, you could have that sort of same vocabulary for the CSS variables. So you know that when you're overwriting this CSS variable for that element or anything within that, thing that goes underneath it, that you'll be hitting that same thing and it'll overlap.
I've got to think about how I would want to do that.
I think there's some pretty good hacks that you can find with, given the penetrability of CSS variables, of having global state with CSS variables and not with something like MobX or something like local storage even.
Okay. Gotta think about that.
I hate your ideas, Aiden. You're proving the utility of us doing this exercise together.
You're going to be as bad as Brian, making us think and pulling us off into 5 different directions, exploring cool shit.
You just got to keep you guys away from MobX at any point in time, right?
Nice.
All right. Does anybody have anything else they're interested in with what Nikki showed before we move on to next topic?
And I still hate you for making me go first.
I do what I can. I don't want to go first, because then you'll be like, what am I going to show that tops that? Just this week.
I have to remember that we're being recorded, so
I appreciate you're censoring yourself in real time. That was very
I'm getting better at this.